I have copies of my comments for everyone, backup materials, which I'll hand out later. I am opposed to rezoning in this in the location that we're discussing. But let me introduce myself. My name is Lisa Spence, and I'm a resident of River Street. I have a master's in environmental health from Tufts University and experience working on a variety of polluted sites as a human health risk assessor, a soil and water sampling team leader, and a technical advisor to community groups dealing with hazardous waste cleanups. Today, I'd like to speak to the human health risks associated with uncapping the former Universal Steel site for construction of any sort. And that's my biggest concern with rezoning it to B4, is that there will be construction. The distribution and concentration of pollutants at the former Universal Steel site causes three big problems for site reuse. First, the site remains highly contaminated. Of the 157 soil samples evaluated at closure, PCBs were found in 86% of the soils tested. 16% of the detections were above 50 parts per million. I apologize for acronyms, but that's considered highly contaminated. And 7 samples were above 1,000 parts per million. EPA didn't stop their cleanup efforts at the site because it was clean. They stopped cleaning up because they ran out of money. They put a cap over it. Secondly, even when soils contain less than 50 parts per million PCBs, they often contain extremely high levels of other pollutants. Thirdly, the soil data from Universal Steel reads like a who's who of dangerous pollutants. PCBs and lead are the most common, but the full list includes over 48 additional pollutants. Notables include mercury, chromium, cadmium, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, tetrachloroethylene, industrial solvents like trichloroethylene, and finally asbestos. Add to these issues that the whole site is just 5 feet above groundwater, and any reuse gets tricky. This is why, after $3.5 million spent on the Universal Steel cleanup, we are left with a capped site and contaminated soils from roughly 4 feet down to at least 15 feet below the surface. The cap and the activity use limitation, or AUL, are working. The current liner and asphalt cap keep contaminated soils from blowing around, while the AUL attached to the property deed alerts the city to the fact that they can't dig on the site. What would happen during construction? If the cap is removed and construction begins at the site, we can expect additional pollutant exposures to primarily abutting residents, but really anyone who passes the site or works nearby. These people can expect to breathe polluted dust. Soil will be excavated and placed in piles. Then 50 to 70% of the soils will have to be mixed with a phosphate powder, EnviroBlend. It's something that the EPA found out you have to do in order to dispose of these sites, the soils. And then the whole pile gets stirred by a big loader. The excavators will agree to spraying water to keep dust down, but it's unlikely that they will. Not even US EPA sprayed soil piles, as I witnessed many times during their remediation driving by on Bridge Street. Spraying makes the soil heavier and its disposal more expensive. On a poorly managed site, trucks and people might track dirt from the site out onto Bridge Street for the duration of the construction and installation of all below-grade utilities like water, gas, and sewer. Any PCB-contaminated soils excavated below 5 feet will need to be specially dewatered. At larger sites, water treatment plants have been brought in, but there will be pressure on the budget to avoid this. Will the damp piles be left out to air dry? Will dams be installed and water containing PCB sediments, lead, chromium, and other site pollutants be pumped into Salem's sewer system? It's far from clear. And the reason I'm saying it's far from clear, I've read through a cleanup proposal by Alliance Environmental Group completed for Webb, and they said nothing about the dewatering. Why worry about a little contaminated dust? For those living close to the site, the more accurate question is why worry about more contaminated dust? Site development will mean that some residents will experience their fifth exposure to Universal Steel's site pollutants. First, residents were exposed to releases that took place over the 60 years that Universal Steel operated and then sat idle. Contaminated dust, solvent fumes, PCBs spilled in abutting neighborhood yards, and the contaminated runoff from the site during flooding. The second time occurred when residents were exposed to soils and dust while the PCBs in 3 neighborhood backyards were excavated. The third time, EPA came back and excavated soils in 2 more neighborhood yards. Most recently, residents were exposed to all the dust generated during the 9 months that US EPA broke apart contaminated concrete, mixed contaminated soils with stabilizer, and dumped contaminated soil and concrete into trucks. So if the site is rezoned and developed, there will be contaminated dust released and people will be exposed all over again. We are talking about seriously polluted dust. Dust from the site may contain any number of chemicals, but most worrying are the pollutants that tend to stick to soil: PCBs, metals, and PAHs. US EPA noted that many of the Universal Steel pollutants are known or expected to cause cancer: arsenic, cadmium, lead, PCBs, and 7 of the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Since PCBs are ubiquitous in site soils, 86%, it is likely that there will be carcinogens in any dust released. But cancer isn't the only concern. The 2 primary site pollutants, PCBs and lead, are also neurotoxic and tend to accumulate in the human body: PCBs to fat and lead to bone, making exposures over a lifetime somewhat additive. This means that, for instance, exposure to lead from site dust should be considered with all the other lead exposures that residents might face: paint dust, water from old pipes, or soil around their homes. This is especially worrying for our most vulnerable residents, young children. And then I spent a lot of time looking at the Remedial Action Plan, which is the 507-page PDF that people have probably seen, and took a look at that along with the Alliance estimate. Webb has said that if they buy the former Universal Steel property, the city must agree to defer their taxes in an aggregate amount equal to the environmental remediation costs required to construct the project. In other words, Salem will reimburse Webb for every penny Webb spends on the extra measures they'll need to take to build at Universal Steel because of the remaining pollutants at the site. Agreeing to this creates a huge financial risk for the city. Once sold, the city will have limited say about any remediation costs. That will be in the hands of US EPA and Webb. It's like writing a blank check. So how much will this remediation cost? Webb's consultant, AEG, its Allied Environmental Group, generated a bare bones estimate that has been quoted in a memorandum of $453,000. So right off the bat, Salem will lose at least that much in tax revenue from Webb in the coming years. At $453,000, Webb's remediation estimate fails to account for at least 6 additional expenses. US EPA found that 50 to 70% of the site soils were so high in leachable lead, it's a test they need to run, that they needed to be treated prior to disposal or sent to an more expensive landfill. US EPA opted to treat all this soil on site with a product called EnviroBlend, and since the AEG estimate didn't include EnviroBlend, Webb will need to send 50 to 70% of excavated site soils to the more expensive landfill. That would result in an additional cost of remediation at roughly $240,000. Site groundwater is at 5 feet below the surface, and the Webb building will be built on a 10-foot foundation. As a result, about half of the PCB contaminated soils removed at the site will be soaking wet. You can't simply haul these soils off in a regular truck, leaking PCB contaminated sediments all the way to Vermont. Those soils will need to be dewatered and the water subsequently treated. This will be expensive. PCB soil dewatering could add $90,000 or more to costs. Webb will not be able to simply place a porous concrete slab on grade at this site. Even with clean fill, Webb below the slab, without excavating a lot more soil than they plan to, any clean soil under the concrete will become contaminated over time as the groundwater level rises during flooding events. Webb will need a vapor barrier. The Webb estimate includes $37,500 for polystyrene sheeting as a vapor barrier. These sheets are fine for insulation, but are not designed for use in this situation. Separated sheets would have to be overlapped or taped together, leaving ample opportunity for leakage. AEG included an estimate for a second option, use of a product called liquid boot in their report. This is a membrane that's applied as a spray and has been used in many similar applications. AEG estimated that use of the appropriate vapor barrier, liquid boot, rather than the polystyrene sheets would increase the cleanup cost by $87,500. Webb's estimate is based on removing 1,200 cubic yards of soil. That may sound like a lot, but it's the equivalent of skimming 14 inches of soil from the footprint of the proposed Webb building.
President, at some point, are we going to give other folks a chance to speak?
Yeah, is there how much more is there?
I only have 2 more issues to raise.
Cover those and let the rest of the.
I'm trying to read really quickly too. Well, because we were only supposed to make comments at one time. I had zoning comments, so I had to combine them with these comments.
We will be just to be aware. Guys, we will be obviously we will be reconvening this later on to hear other issues. So I'd like to focus primarily on zoning. I can see this was going to go. So let's rest it and
I'll speed up. Okay.
finish this one.
Okay. So they have an estimate for soil removal. All I'm saying is that if you increase that soil estimate by a mere 25%, remediation costs go up by $78,000. Webb's contractor has also estimated that 50% more time will be needed for LSP and engineering if US EPA gets involved. If the site were straightforward, US EPA might not need to play a role. But this site has extremely high levels of PCBs and lead, PCB-contaminated soils that need to be dewatered. It's in a floodplain and adjacent to a residential area. It's not a simple site, and US EPA is more than likely to get involved. AEG has estimated that US EPA involvement will increase the cost of the cleanup by $125,000. In this cleanup, US EPA removed all of the concrete structures on the site except one, the vault that used to house the metal baler. It's big, 10 feet by 10 feet and 30 feet deep. The concrete hasn't been sampled yet, but likely contains PCBs since the oil collected in the bottom contained PCBs. It's located directly along one of Webb's proposed foundation walls and will need to be broken up for disposal, if not in its entirety, then at least the top third. This is an additional 33 tons of contaminated concrete. Removal of the top third of the vault could add as much as $9,900. When we add up all the additional expenses, the more likely cost of site remediation is $1,085,000, very close to the ballpark estimate in the RAP of $1 million, and represents a huge amount of revenue lost to the city of Salem. Thank you.
During this